Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
Now, when we talk about the golden age of radio, we tend to kind of put our nostalgic glasses on and think about all the great shows that have come down to us from the 1930s and 40s and 50s, like The Shadow and The Lone Ranger and Suspense and so on. I grew up listening to a lot of those. And you know, when you're young and you are introduced to the theater of the imagination at that perfect age when the pictures you come up with in your mind are so much better than anything you can see on television. You know, there's a special magic to it. But when we think about it in this nostalgic sense, it's easy to forget that the arrival of the radio marked this kind of seismic shift in the way people understand their place in the world, a shift that's really comparable to the invention of the printing press, or more recently, the advent of the internet. Suddenly, for the first time, Americans could feel plugged in to momentous events happening all over the world, no matter where they were. They could listen in on history being made right in the moment. Nowadays, we tend to kind of take this for granted, but back then it was huge, even magical. I mean, back in 1938, there were folks still alive who could remember the Civil War, when news might take weeks to arrive. And all of a sudden, they could tune in on Adolf Hitler giving a speech an ocean away. And this new perspective had profound consequences for journalism and politics in the United States and indeed around the world. So there's some debate over when exactly news broadcasting began in this country. The award should probably go to station KDKA in Pittsburgh for their live broadcast of the presidential election in 1920. But broadcast journalism as we know it today really got started in March of 1932 with the crime of the century, the kidnapping of the infant son of the aviator Charles Lindbergh in Hopewell, New Jersey. Lindbergh, of course, was perhaps the most famous man in the world at that time, a national hero, and public interest in the case was intense, rivaling that of the O.J. Simpson trial more than half a century later. The newspapers, which could only print at most a few editions every day, couldn't possibly keep up with the demand for new details and the latest, most up-to-date information. So radio stepped in, broadcasting bulletin after bulletin about every twist and turn in the case, practically from the moment that the child disappeared. And when the alleged kidnapper went on trial in 1935, radio was there again, reporting the courtroom play-by-play so rapidly that at least one station, in their haste to scoop the competition, reported the wrong verdict, which still happens from time to time in our news media today. As you might imagine, the particular power of radio to be both intimate and expansive, its unique ability to touch millions of people in a deep way simultaneously, held a special appeal for politicians. Most famously, President Franklin Roosevelt became a regular presence in American homes thanks to his fireside chats in the 1930s, in which he often tried to calm and reassure the country during one of the darkest and scariest periods in our history. But even as FDR sought to remind his listeners that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, other radio voices stoked the fires of fear and anger even higher. Michigan's own Father Charles Coughlin, you see at the lower left there, the radio priest from Royal Oak, built a massive following in the 1930s with these Nazi-esque speeches railing against international bankers and urging the creation of a crypto-fascist corporate state. Senator Huey Long on the right of Louisiana used the radio to turn himself into a truly national figure, one who might have challenged FDR for the presidency had he not been assassinated in 1935. Long was an extraordinarily charismatic radio speaker with a down-home kind of folksy style of speaking that many found particularly authentic or familiar. He was so good on the air, in fact, that the radio networks would give him free airtime in order to boost their own ratings. And this gave him a platform rivaling even that of the President of the United States. Father Coughlin, by contrast, had to pay for his use of the airwaves, but Long got all the airtime essentially for free. And he used it to promote a populist message that America was, quote, going straight to hell, end quote, and the president couldn't save it. He proposed a share the wealth program that would cap large incomes and guarantee everyone a minimum income of at least $2,000 a year, free college tuition, and all these other things. None of it added up, but to many Americans that didn't matter because Long was, in the words of one rival, quote, the most persuasive man living, unquote. Long explained his strategy to one interviewer by saying, never explain, my boy, never explain. First you must come into power, and then you do things. Thanks to the radio, Long didn't have to explain. He could reach out to millions of people and convince them of anything, simply with the power of his voice. But even as radio collapsed the distance between politicians and public, it posed a new problem for journalists. Much of the radio's power stemmed from its immediacy, the fact that it could bring distant events right into your living room, which, again, nobody had ever experienced before. Listeners gradually came to expect that whatever they heard on the radio was happening now, in the moment. And the major broadcast networks responded by banning the use of pre-recorded content. Everything that they aired live. They did so because they didn't want to deceive their listeners. They feared that, for example, airing a recording of FDR's latest speech would trick people into thinking that he was speaking now. And that placed broadcast journalists almost in a straitjacket, preventing them from airing any news events that didn't happen within the reach of a live microphone. Take, for example, the famous recording of the Hindenburg explosion in May 1937. Most people remember this as a live broadcast, but it wasn't. Announcer Herbert Morrison just happened to be recording a description of the Zeppelin's landing when it burst into flames. And his recording was so exceptional that the major broadcast networks decided to break their own rule for the first time and air it after making very clear disclaimers that this was a recording and not a live event. But Americans had become so conditioned to accepting radio broadcasts as live events that apparently many did believe that the Hindenburg was exploding before their very ears, proving that the network's fears had some validity. So the broadcasters got around this ban on recordings by developing a new way of reporting the news, one that they hoped would capture all the drama and immediacy of live events. They simply restaged news events in a studio with music, sound effects, and actors impersonating real people, everyone from FDR to Huey Long to Amelia Earhart to Adolf Hitler, whoever. And this was somehow seen as more authentic than airing a recording, even though the performances were totally fake. The program that pioneered this style of dramatized journalism, which Henry Luce once called fakery in allegiance to the truth, was The March of Time, which you see on the slide. Although it ranked as the most popular news program of the 1930s, The March of Time wasn't technically journalism at all, but rather an advertisement for Time magazine. It would dramatize the stories that you could read about in that week's issue. And yet many Americans found it more entertaining than straight news reporting, and much as with, for example, The Daily Show many decades later, they would use it as their regular source of news. The impersonations were said to be so good that most listeners didn't know they were hearing actors and not the people being portrayed. And this is kind of dangerous, right? Because these performances could shape how Americans view the individuals in question. Think about the impersonations we see on Saturday Night Live, where these performances oftentimes replace our memories of the actual candidates, and sometimes, more recently, the candidates seem to be acting like the people impersonated. And it took a certain kind of actor to pull off these impressions. The March of Time employed only the best in the business, including a young man who some of you may have heard of, Orson Welles. Now this is where Welles got his first big break into broadcasting when he was not yet 20 years old. And he appeared regularly on The March of Time over the next few years as he steadily rose to prominence in the New York theater world. By the fall of 1938, the 23-year-old Welles had his own radio series on CBS, the Mercury Theater on the Air, and he filled its cast and crew with people he'd gotten to know on The March of Time, among them some names you may be familiar with, Agnes Moorehead, Ray Collins, Frank Reddick, and sound effects technician Orrin Nichols. Inevitably, the March of Time style of fakery and allegiance to the truth left its mark on the Mercury Theater on the Air, most especially in its breakout episode, The War of the Worlds. At that time, Welles's series had a relatively small audience. It was up against an immensely popular show on NBC, The Chase and Sanborn Hour, starring ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy, though if anybody in the room knows how a ventriloquist act can work on the radio, please explain it to me after the show. Nobody wanted to buy advertising opposite Bergen and McCarthy because the show was so popular. So CBS essentially gave the time slot to Orson Welles in the name of public service. The networks did this all the time back in the 1930s, airing what were called sustaining shows. Programs without a commercial sponsor that the broadcasters would pay for out of pocket and which were supposed to be educational, informational, or edifying in some way. They did this because the airwaves were considered, and still are considered, public property, licensed by the government to broadcasters who would operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. That's how it's phrased in the law. In other words, they struck a deal with the people. The networks could make money airing sponsored shows like the Chase and Sanborn Hour, which were designed to grab as many listeners as possible. But they also had to give back by airing unbiased news commentary, discussion programs on major national issues, and a lot of symphony music. The Mercury Theater on the Air fit this public interest bill because it dramatized great works of literature from authors like William Shakespeare, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Charles Dickens. But for the night before Halloween, Sunday, October 30th, 1938, Orson Welles wanted to do something a little different from his previous offerings. As Welles explained it many years later, I had conceived the idea of doing a radio broadcast in such a manner that a crisis would actually seem to be happening, and would be broadcast in such a dramatized form as to appear to be a real event taking place at that time, rather than a mere radio play. But the whole point of the radio series was to adapt great works of literature, and he couldn't think of a book to which he could apply this idea. So he discussed it with two of his key collaborators, his producer John Houseman on the upper right there, and actor Paul Stewart, lower right, who served as the associate director on the Mercury broadcasts. Eventually, one of them suggested The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, no relation to Orson. H.G. Wells, incidentally, celebrated his 150th birthday last month. It's unclear who among this group first brought the novel up. Houseman later wrote that he doubted Orson Welles had ever read it. But Welles embraced the novel, and Houseman passed his instructions on to Howard Koch, a young writer who had been recently employed to script the Mercury radio show, and who would later go on to win an Academy Award for the screenplay for Casablanca. That same week, Welles was preparing the Mercury's first stage production of the season, and this left him with precious little time to spend on The War of the Worlds, beyond suggesting the initial idea. So the original novel, of course, describes a Martian invasion of England around the turn of the century. The invaders land in the small town of Woking and rapidly conquer the United Kingdom before 120-year-old, spoiler alert, dying from earthbound bacteria against which they have no immunity. Howard Koch didn't much like the book, finding it both dated and ridiculous, and he initially tried to get Welles and Houseman to give him a different assignment. When that failed, he produced a script that updated the story to the present day, structured the first part of the show as a series of fake news bulletins, and landed the Martians in the tiny town of Grover's Mill, New Jersey. And if you are in the area today and you visit, you'll see a monument at the site of the Martian landing site. I encourage anyone in the audience to check it out. The cast and crew rehearsed the script on the Thursday before the show, and the results were absolutely dreadful. Everyone in the Mercury believed that this 40-year-old science fiction story was too silly to ever be taken seriously. Fearing that their audiences would abandon them in droves, the cast and crew began making changes meant to enhance the realism of the show without realizing just how well they might succeed. And in trying to save the broadcast, they fell back on the style of fakery and allegiance to the truth that they'd learned from the March of Time. So actor Frank Reddick, a March of Time veteran cast as the reporter who witnesses the Martians' arrival, scrounged up a recording of the Hindenburg broadcast and listened to it over and over again, studying the way the announcer's voice swells in alarm and abject horror. That was how actors on the March of Time perfected their impressions, and Reddick replicated those emotions in the recording with remarkable accuracy. I'll play you a couple of clips, first from the Hindenburg broadcast itself, and then Reddick in War of the Worlds, so you can hear what I mean. And
500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the frame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the Humanities, all the passengers.
And here's War of the Worlds.
What's that? There's a jet of flames springing from the mirror that leaps straight at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Ah! The whole field's caught by the woods of fires. The gas spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my left.
So again, similar emotions, but also very similar language. It's burst into flame, they're turning into flame. You can tell it's very clearly based on the Hindenburg broadcast. Other members of the cast and crew made their own improvements, suggesting changes in the script, developing terrifyingly realistic sound effects, and perfecting the musical interludes that would come between the fake news bulletins. But as airtime approached, the Mercurians remained convinced that the show would be a disaster. One actor warned a writer from the New York Daily News that the show was, quote, lousy, and would probably bore you to death. When Welles finally took charge of the show on the afternoon of Sunday, October 30th, about 6 hours before airtime, he found himself with his back against the wall. The stage play he was producing was shaping up to be a disaster. It would only end up running for 21 performances, and he had every reason to believe that War of the Worlds would be an even bigger mess. His only hope, really, for saving his career was pouring all of his creative energies into the broadcast, and he began making some changes of his own. And it just so happened that these last-minute revisions were the parts most likely to convince listeners that the whole thing was real. So the first important change that Welles made involved the beginning of the show, where music from a dance band keeps getting interrupted by news flashes about the Martians' arrival. Now, if you assume that the broadcast happens in real time, the invasion moves much too fast to be real. The aliens take off from Mars, land in New Jersey, destroy the United States military, and conquer New York City all in the space of about 40 minutes. But after years of listening to shows like The March of Time, audiences had grown accustomed to radio's ability to shuffle them across great distances in an instant, from New York one minute to Europe the next, then on to California, then maybe Asia, and so on. And remember the sense of immediacy, of liveness, of something happening somewhere else in the world right as you're listening in. As two psychologists wrote of The March of Time in 1935, in annihilating auditory distance, the radio has to some extent destroyed for the listener his capacity to distinguish between real and imaginary events. Welles used this trick to great effect in The War of the Worlds. He drastically slowed the pacing of these early scenes by adding dialogue and drawing out the music to the point of tedium. Hausman, his producer, objected strenuously, believing that this whole section was unbearably boring. But Welles overruled them. He understood that listeners would only accept the unrealistic speed of the invasion if the broadcast started slowly, then gradually sped up. By the station break, even most listeners who knew the show was fiction would be carried away by the speed of it all. And for any who did not, those 40 minutes would seem like hours. Another of Welles's changes involved something cut from Koch's first draft, a speech given by the Secretary of War describing the government's efforts to combat the Martians. Now, this material was probably cut because of objections from CBS's lawyers, who were uneasy about impersonating a cabinet official, even though The March of Time did this kind of thing all the time. When Welles put it back in, he reassigned it to a less inflammatory cabinet member, the Secretary of the Interior, for some reason, in order to appease the network, but that change didn't dampen the effect at all. Many listeners found the most convincing thing about the broadcast to be the way it used the names of real institutions and figures of authority, such as the Secretary of the Interior, the Governor of New Jersey, the Red Cross, and Princeton University. Listeners regarded these titles essentially as trademarks, falsely assuming that they could not be invoked without the government's permission. Therefore, if the announcer said that the Secretary of the Interior was going to give a special broadcast on the national emergency, even though the Secretary of the Interior would never address the nation in this kind of a crisis, then it had to be true no matter what. Truly, the broadcast seemed incredible, one listener later wrote, but not as incredible as the thought that our government would allow its name to be used to disseminate such a lie. To play the Secretary of the Interior, Welles cast another actor he knew from The March of Time, Kenneth Delmar, on the lower right there, who could do a pitch-perfect impersonation of President Roosevelt. FDR's voice was so well known and so influential that the White House had actually asked the March of Time to stop impersonating him, so as not to rob his radio voice of its power. By 1938, the major broadcast networks expressly forbade anyone from impersonating the president. But during the last-minute rehearsals on War of the Worlds, Welles suggested with a wink and a nod that Delmar make his character sound presidential, and Delmar happily complied. Let me play for you now a clip from Roosevelt's first fireside chat in 1933, where he's trying to calm and reassure the American people at a time of economic calamity.
Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friend. Your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
And now for comparison, here's Delmar in War of the Worlds. And notice he's addressing the audience, not just in FDR's voice, but using very similar language again, as he tries to calm a frightened populace.
I wish to impress upon you, private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action. Placing our faith in God, we must continue the performance of our duties, each and every one of us, so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth.
I don't believe that Welles had any intention of misleading listeners by having Delmar impersonate the president. All the evidence suggests that he was merely trying to capture what an actual crisis broadcast would sound like, and such broadcasts always include remarks from the President of the United States. But by copying the techniques of the March of Time to add realism to something that was not real, Welles unwittingly showed the dangers of fakery and allegiance to the truth, this mix of journalism and entertainment that was becoming increasingly popular. And within a very short time, the entire country knew it. So the War of the Worlds aired at 8 p.m. on Sunday, October 30th, 1938. The next day, Halloween, Americans woke up to headlines such as this one from the Chicago Herald and Examiner, announcing that the show had thrown their country into a mass panic. Quote, "A wave of mass hysteria seized thousands of radio listeners throughout the nation," wrote the New York Times, "which disrupted households, interrupted religious services, caused traffic jams, and clogged communication systems." End quote. The fright was reported to be most intense in New York and New Jersey, the states directly under attack from the Martians, but the Associated Press collected stories of panic from as far afield as Atlanta, Kansas City, and San Francisco. They reported that in Pittsburgh, a man found his wife about to drink poison before the invaders got her, screaming, "I'd rather die this way than like that." In Indianapolis, an unnamed woman interrupted a church service by shouting, "New York destroyed, it's the end of the world. You might as well go home to die. I just heard it on the radio." In Reno, Nevada, wrote the AP, one man immediately started east in hopes of aiding the wife he was there to divorce. Now, these stories of panic earned a permanent place in our popular culture, constantly told and retold in films, TV shows, novels, and comic books. And yet, the more you look at the news coverage of the broadcast in the days after it aired, the more you realize that those articles were themselves a kind of fake news. Hastily compiled in the hours after the broadcast, they're filled with a lot of vague anecdotal reports and sweeping generalizations, but precious little verifiable information. Journalists in 1938 did almost no follow-up reporting in the days after the show, and were it not for a Gallup poll commissioned 6 weeks later by Princeton University, we would not today have even the faintest idea how many people heard the broadcast, much less how many had believed it to be true. Given the flaws in all that coverage, many scholars have been quick to dismiss the War of the Worlds hysteria as a media-created myth. But to really get at the truth of what happened that night, you need to experience the broadcast through the eyes and ears of the people who first heard it more than 3/4 of a century ago. Their voices, unfiltered by the mistaken assumptions of reporters or academics, reveal that War of the Worlds caused something less than a panic, but more than a myth. Looking back from the social media age, we can see it as perhaps history's first viral media phenomenon, and it offers us a lesson in how to avoid falling for fake news today. Now, fortunately, many of the people who first heard War of the Worlds put their experiences down in writing. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor preserves roughly 1,400 letters about the broadcast written to Wells and the Mercury Theater, which you see here. I first learned of them as an undergraduate back in 2010 while writing my senior thesis, I became the first person to study them in over 70 years. Another 600 letters sent to the Federal Communications Commission are on file at the National Archives. Taken together, this gives us nearly 2,000 pieces of correspondence from the most famous radio show in history. The letters are remarkably, even exquisitely detailed, sometimes running to as many as 15 pages, carefully describing how each listener experienced War of the Worlds. They came from a broad swath of Americans, literally from penthouses to prisons, living all over the United States. And they capture the full range of responses to the broadcast, from hysterical praise to hysterical fury. Written in the immediate aftermath of the show, and let's just pause to enjoy this one if you can read it. For God's sake, stop apologizing for that thing. It was the greatest service you've ever done or ever will do for mankind. Written to Orson Welles. Written in the immediate aftermath of the show, in some cases mere minutes after it ended, and without the interference of historical hindsight, this is as complete and accurate a record of War of the Worlds as we are ever likely to see. Now, these letters confirm that the broadcast deeply frightened some fraction of its audience, though only a small minority. We don't know how many, all told. The best estimate says about 1 million, but that's essentially a guess, out of a total audience of maybe 6 million. What we do know is that very, very few people panicked in the way that the newspapers later described. Some tuned in late, briefly believed the broadcast to be true until they heard the first references to Martians, and quickly realized that the whole thing was a science fiction story. Others listened for 10, 15, 20 minutes in an agitated state until the station break came and they breathed a great sigh of relief. Only a handful took to the streets, armed themselves, or did anything else that could be described as panicking. And the vast majority of people taken in by War of the Worlds, and this is a key point, most people frightened by the broadcast did not realize that the show was about aliens. Most thought they were listening to news reports of a Nazi attack or some kind of natural disaster. Even for truly terrified listeners, panic was the exception and not the rule. But instead of fleeing or panicking, many audience members fell prey to a more common and perhaps more dangerous impulse, the need to spread the news. In dozens of letters, frightened listeners described phoning up or going to see friends or relatives, telling them to turn on CBS or get out of the path of the invaders. Dozens more came from people who tuned in only because they were on the receiving end of those calls, or because their next-door neighbors burst in to warn them about the catastrophe in New Jersey. This created small pockets of hysteria scattered across the United States. Anywhere a lot of people live close together, fear could easily become contagious, rapidly infecting dozens of other people. And this viral effect is essential to understanding the reports of people running in the streets that night. Listeners ran next door to warn friends and neighbors or to seek confirmation of what they had heard. But this was very much a localized phenomenon, intense where it was felt, but not felt very widely. The vast majority of Americans, even those living in New Jersey, saw no panic and had no idea anything unusual was going on until they opened their morning newspaper the next day. The hysteria that night had as much to do with the power of rumor as it did with the power of radio. Fake news still works this way today. And if you remember nothing else from our time together, please remember this. Studies have shown that a greater and greater number of Americans use social media sites like Twitter and Facebook as their primary source of news. But there are a couple problems with this. First, you tend to be friends with or follow only people that you already agree with. And this makes you less likely to encounter information that challenges your worldview. You're living essentially in an echo chamber, just like the people in those pockets of hysteria created by War of the Worlds. You're more likely in that scenario to fall prey to bad information because you're surrounded by people who believe it too. And the second problem with using social media as a news source is that a lot of bad information slips through. At 140 characters, a tweet is even more compact, than a radio news bulletin, and it is even more easily shared. It's also harder to fact check. There's an old saying that says a lie can go around the world while the truth is still getting its boots on, and that's even truer today. In 1938, listeners had to pick up a phone or run next door to spread the news of the Martian invasion. Now they could satisfy that impulse with a single click. So for instance, here's a headline from a while back that got a lot of play on social media. Pope Francis endorses Bernie Sanders for president. The article itself got shared many times. You probably can't see, but from the image, about 21,000 times on Facebook. And that quote from it, I see Senator Bernard Sanders as a man of great integrity and moral conviction who understands these principles and generally wants what's best for all people. That comes from the article, and people turned it into a meme, which is one of these things. If you spend any time on Facebook, you see a lot of these memes that people share. It's a photo and some text, and they kind of do it because it's a lot easier than actually articulating their own political beliefs. They just share these things. So the article comes from a site called the National Report. You can see at the very top of the screen, which looks legit. You might confuse it with the magazine, The National Review. And the story is a bit incredible, yet still kind of believable. Not outside, not entirely beyond the pale. Particularly if you like Bernie Sanders, you might want to believe this to be true. But it isn't. The whole thing is fake. National Report is one of many websites that generate fake news stories which might seem plausible, but which are calculated to either excite or enrage people in order to get them to share them on social media. It's called clickbait, because websites that sell advertising charge by the click. See these ads at the bottom of the screen there? There's more you can't see that are under the meme. Every time a hapless Facebook user clicks on this page, National Report makes a little bit of money from the advertisers, and over time, 21,000 of these hits, it can add up to quite a lot over time. So that's the fake news. That's the war of the worlds in many cases of the 21st century. So the thing to do, if you see a headline or a meme that seems too good to be true or that raises your ire in some way, is to try and verify it, right? To go to Google or Snopes or something and see if you can find out whether it's been debunked. Radio listeners who heard War of the Worlds in 1938 didn't have that option, of course, but many did the next best thing. They began calling police, radio stations, and newspaper offices to try and verify what they'd heard over the radio. Suddenly, on this quiet Sunday evening, telephone switchboards began lighting up from coast to coast. Reporters, overwhelmed with calls about a disaster in New Jersey, had every reason to believe that something monumental was going on. At the same time, bulletins started coming in over the teletype machines describing business such as the woman in Pittsburgh who almost committed suicide, or the woman who broke up a church service in Indianapolis screaming about the end of the world. Taken together, these bulletins seemed to paint a picture of a nation in headlong flight from imaginary aliens. And rather than taking the time to investigate what had actually happened, these journalists quickly extrapolated, based on these extreme examples of fright, a nationwide panic that had never actually existed. The press didn't have much incentive to dig any deeper. The radio, remember, had revolutionized their business just within the past decade, much like the internet has today. Even back then, people would often claim that print journalism was dying. And just like newspapers and cable channels in the 21st century, the 1930s press tried to save itself by doing anything it could to grab attention. The name of the game has always been grabbing eyeballs, whether with huge headlines, alarming bulletins, or enticing tweets. A story like War of the Worlds was simply too good to pass up. It was the 1930s equivalent of clickbait. As the managing director of CBS News observed in 1947, not in every case, but in too many cases, news stories are written to justify headlines which will make people want to buy newspapers. And nothing sells papers like Martians and panic. So out of sloppiness and haste, the press created this compelling yet inaccurate narrative that War of the Worlds had thrown the entire country into chaos, causing untold numbers of people to act bizarrely and irrationally. In time, many people would come to consider this idea much more frightening than the prospect of a Martian attack. It seemed to suggest that the media was incredibly powerful, capable of making people believe virtually anything. The fear that saturates these letters is not of Martians, but of what damage this new instrument of propaganda might do to the country. In notes and telegrams to Wells and the FCC, hundreds of people whom the broadcast had not frightened denounced those whom it had, calling them ignorant, unintelligent, weak links in the chain of democracy. Several suggested that listeners who had panicked should lose access to the radio. One Indiana man insisted in his letter to Wells that anyone, quote, deceived by the realistic drama would, in an ideal society, be sterilized and disenfranchised. In some ways, these irate, knee-jerk reactions were the real War of the Worlds panic, but they were based on a false narrative that greatly mischaracterized a vast swath of Americans. By playing on the nation's fears, the panic story turned the country on itself. A fake news story that big has the power to bend reality. After War of the Worlds, there were calls for greater government censorship of radio in order to prevent something like it from ever happening again. To keep that from happening, the major broadcast networks began rigidly censoring themselves, blocking any programs that might seem at all offensive, and killing much of the innovation that had created the golden age of radio. You can make the argument in some cases that the slow death of radio as an American art form began with the backlash surrounding War of the Worlds. The March of Time was one of the casualties. It went off the air within about a year of the show. And as the exaggerated panic story went down in history, it forever changed how we understand the power of the media. Academics, journalists, and others still cite it as proof that audiences will believe anything they see or hear, even though a closer look at the event proves that they won't. Orson Welles almost didn't survive the furor his broadcast stirred up. For a while, it looked like he might even be arrested. But in the end, he profited from his newfound notoriety. As Welles later put it, I didn't go to jail, I went to Hollywood. Without directing War of the Worlds at age 23, Welles would never have gone on to direct Citizen Kane, revolutionizing cinema in the process, at age 26. And Kane, like War of the Worlds, is all about fakery and allegiance to the truth. It's the story of Charles Foster Kane, a media baron and flamboyant celebrity who very nearly rises to high political office before dying a recluse, walled off in his palatial Florida estate. The film includes a fake newsreel based on the March of Time, and one of the first things that we hear Kane say after his immortal last word, Rosebud, is perhaps a sly reference to War of the Worlds. Quote, don't believe everything you hear on the radio, end quote. Throughout the film, Kane uses his power and wealth to try and reshape reality, as if he can turn the truth into whatever he wants it to be. When a foreign correspondent reports seeing no war in Cuba, Kane tells him, you provide the prose poems, I'll provide the war. When Kane suffers a humiliating electoral defeat brought on by the revelation of his past sexual indiscretions, his newspaper protects his vanity by blaming the result on widespread voter fraud. He goes from wielding tremendous influence. Incidentally, Citizen Kane is the favorite film of one of this year's presidential candidates. He goes from wielding tremendous influence over the American mass mind to being trapped inside a media bubble of his own creation. And I sometimes wonder if his fate is not a preview of our own. Back in 2010, as luck would have it, 72 years to the day after the War of the Worlds broadcast, Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert held a rally to restore sanity and/or fear on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Stewart appeared as the well-meaning voice of reason, urging us to come together. Colbert played the ill-informed pundit, driving us apart by stoking fear of threats that, like the Martians in 1938, were not real. The whole point of the event, as Stewart explained in his closing speech, was to show that, quote, the image of America that is reflected back to us by our political and media process is false. It is us, through a funhouse mirror, and not the good kind that makes you look slim in the waist and maybe taller. Our news media amplify crisis and conflict because they are dependent on advertising. For the sake of a shocking headline or an engaging piece, they all too often twist the facts of a news story or greatly mischaracterize a huge swath of people. Regularly, they promote false equivalencies as if both positions are equally valid. And as our media become ever more fragmented, as we pick and choose news sources based on our predetermined beliefs, we risk becoming trapped in our own alternate realities, each with its own set of facts, and false narratives of the kind that War of the Worlds created. This, more than anything else, I think explains why our country is so deeply divided today. Our media have trapped us in different worlds. We can't decide on how to solve our problems if we can't agree that those problems even exist. That's why it's so important for us to remember War of the Worlds and the two kinds of fake news that it spawned. First, remember the broadcast itself and the people who fell for it whenever you see an alarming headline or a Facebook post. Be like those listeners who called up the newspapers and police to see if the invasion was real, and not those who rushed to tell all of their friends that the end of the world had arrived. But also remember the larger fake news narrative that the press created and spun out of that night, and the ways it got twisted and distorted beyond all resemblance to the truth. There's more information out there now, good and bad, than ever before, but it's up to you to make sense of it. But you can still trust what you read in books, or at least this one. Thank you all very much.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo.